Welcome to the Apostolic Inc. podcast. Apostolic Inc. is the official podcast of Dr. Jason Weatherly. In each episode, Dr. Weatherly addresses the tough theological issues of the 21st century church. No huff, no fluff, just thus says the Word of God. And now, here's your host, Dr. Weatherly.
Thank you, anonymous radio announcer, and welcome, listening audience, to another informative episode of the Apostolic Inc. podcast. The Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, has made major news from their recent meeting in sunny Orlando, Florida, where the attendees voted overwhelmingly, approximately 75%, to approve an amendment which states that any church that affirms, appoints, or employs a woman as a pastor, elder, or overseer is not in friendly cooperation with the SBC. If this amendment passes again in 2027, the SBC can remove any church with a woman pastor. I'm not going to get into the dynamics of women preachers and women pastors in the SBC, but I will talk about it from a biblical and practical point of view. Women in ministry, especially women serving as pastors, has been a highly debated topic among Oneness Pentecostals, even from the beginning of the modern Pentecostal movement in the early 1900s. Most major Oneness Pentecostal organizations, such as the PAW, UPCI, ALJC, and WPF, recognize or license women preachers, including women as pastors. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone licensed or ordained in those organizations have to recognize women preachers or pastors, because I can tell you firsthand that women pastors is certainly a hot topic of debate within the United Pentecostal Church, no matter what the UPCI manual says. And I've always found this curious. Why would a person hold a license with the UPCI and then complain or debate about the issue of women preachers and pastors when you knew the UPCI's official doctrinal statement on the issue before you got your license? I mean, it's not like the UPCI just started licensing women preachers in the past decade. This has been the UPCI's official position since the merger in 1945. Now, there are some smaller oneness organizations that do not license or ordain women preachers or pastors. I'm pretty sure the Apostolic Assemblies and the Cool JC do not license or ordain women preachers, let alone women pastors. And by the way, I have friends in both the Apostolic Assemblies and the Cool JCs, and I have friends who are associated with independent fellowships that do not recognize women preachers at all. I personally do not make a person's view on women preachers and pastors a test of fellowship, if they are respectful in their views. But what does the Bible say about women pastors? Is there a sense in which a woman can serve as a preacher, but not as a pastor? Or are these two ministries intrinsically connected? The three major passages that come up in discussion on women in ministry, especially women as pastors, are 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 through 35, 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 through 15, and 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 13. We could also throw in Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, but that's basically the same qualifications mentioned in 1 Timothy 3, so we'll just deal with that together with this. Now, I'm not going to exegete each of these pericopes in depth in this episode. I'll save that for later episodes, but I will give an overview of each passage. 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35 says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in the church." First, this is not a quotation from the Corinthian letter mentioned in chapter 7, as some have tried to dismiss or work around the text. This is an actual statement from Paul to correct an issue in the Corinthian church, and we know this because Paul uses the similar language in other areas of the letter to correct similar issues. Second, women are not the only persons that Paul told to keep silent in the church. Go up just a few verses to 1 Corinthians 14, 27 through 28, and you'll read where Paul said, "If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be two or at the most three, each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there be no interpreter, let him keep silent in church, and let him speak to himself and to God." This is the same phrase as in verse 34 regarding the women. The only difference is that the verb keep silent, sigao, in verse 28 is a third person masculine singular. Let him keep silent. And in verse 34, it is a third person feminine plural. Let them, that is the women, keep silent. Notice that when Paul is talking about tongues and interpretation, the silence is not a universal or absolute silence, because Paul says, let him keep silent in church and let him speak to himself and to God, which Paul describes as speaking in tongues in verse 2. So how can you keep silent and speak at the same time? Paul is basically saying, if you don't have the interpretation to a message in tongues, be quiet and pray in tongues yourself. But again, notice the fact that Paul told them to keep silent in church does not mean that a person who speaks in tongues cannot preach or serve as a pastor. He was correcting a specific issue in the Corinthian church. Then in verses 29 and 30, Paul instructs, let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others judge. But if anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. Same verb, sigao. So again, the fact that Paul told the prophets to keep silent does not mean they cannot preach or pastor a church. Keep silent is in regards to a specific type of speaking, which was causing confusion in the Corinthian church. And we can infer this from the context. Too many people were giving a loud message in tongues at the same time, and either no one was giving an interpretation or they were giving fake interpretations. And Paul corrected this by telling them, if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in church and speak unto himself and to God. And then by that same token, there were too many prophets speaking at one time, and no one was discerning or judging whether these statements were true. And Paul corrected this confusion by telling the prophets that if something is revealed to a prophet, let the others keep silent. None of which means that they couldn't preach or pastor a church. So then we come to the women. Paul is also addressing a specific issue in the Corinthian church, which again, we can deduce or glean from the context. Paul is addressing married women in the congregation, and we understand that by the fact that he states that they are to be submissive, which, by the way, outside of children obey your parents, the only person that a woman is ever told to be submissive to is her husband. And I'll mention this again in just a bit. But in 1 Corinthians 14, we know for sure that Paul is talking to wives because he specifically says, and if they want to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, which implies that these wives were disrupting the service by asking men questions to the point that Paul had to tell them to ask their questions at home. And this is similar to how Paul corrected the issue of people turning the Lord's Supper into a buffet or potluck when he said in chapter 11, verse 34, but if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home. So 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35 is not Paul prohibiting women from preaching or serving as pastors any more than Paul telling the tongue talkers and the prophets to keep silent in church prohibits them from preaching or pastoring. And I'll go more in depth on these passages in a future episode. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, Paul begins by addressing the men, plural. I would therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. And then in verse 9, he addresses the women, plural. In like manner also, the women adorn themselves. But then in verse 11, he focuses his attention on a specific woman, singular. Let a woman learn in silence in all submission. Not just submission, all submission. Passe hupotage. The only person that a woman is commanded to be in all submission to is her husband. Women, in general, are not under subjection to all men. The head of the wife is her husband. 1 Corinthians 11:3, Ephesians 5:23. If you're not a husband, then you are not the head of anyone. And I'll do a separate episode on the meaning of head or kephale. It does not mean source or origin, as some people report. But back to 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Now here I prefer the King James Version because I think it picks up the nuance of the Greek better. Ude authentane, nor usurp authority over. The words woman and man in this passage in Greek are gene and aner, which are the same words for wife and husband. Context dictates whether Genei and Aner are talking about a woman and man in general or a wife and husband. 99% of the time when Genei and Aner occur together in the New Testament, it refers to a wife and husband. And again, I'll go into more details on that in a future episode. But just know that there are English translations that render this passage as, I do not permit a wife to teach or domineer over her husband. Now we know that Paul is talking about a marriage relationship between a wife and husband from the immediate context where he says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. Well, who were Adam and Eve? Husband and wife. Eve was not created to be some random woman in the garden. She was specifically created to be Adam's wife. Then Paul concludes, nevertheless, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Now, without getting into the soteriological implications of this statement, childbearing takes place in a marriage. He's not talking about women teaching in church. Paul is dealing with the relationship between a wife and a husband. If they, presumably the wife and husband, if they continue in faith. 1 Timothy 2:11-15 is not a temporary prohibition against women preachers or pastors. And again, I'll go into the specifics of that in another episode, but it is Paul's instructions for a wife not to teach or usurp authority over her husband. Now keep in mind, while Paul wrote to Timothy, he was also indirectly writing to the Ephesians as indicated in 1 Timothy 1:3. So this was the same congregation that Paul said in Ephesians 5:23, wives, submit yourselves under your own husbands. And there is also a strong comparison between 1 Timothy 2:11-15 and 1 Peter 3:1-7, where every English version translates it as wives and husbands. So again, 1 Timothy 2:11-15 is not a prohibition against women preachers and pastors. Paul was dealing with a wife not domineering over her husband. Finally, in 1 Timothy 3:1-13, it is a list of qualifications for bishops, deacons, and women. Now, people who oppose women preachers and pastors often focus on the fact that Paul said that a bishop, which we understand a bishop as the pastor of the church, not the pastor emeritus. A bishop must be the husband of one wife. Paul says the same thing about deacons in verse 12. Let the deacons be the husbands of one wife. So the argument goes, well, a woman can't be a husband, so only men can be pastors and deacons. And the problem is that the conclusion of their statement isn't really consistent to what Paul said. If this is going to be your strong argument that a woman can't be a husband, so women can't serve as pastors and deacons, then you need to be consistent and say that only husbands can be pastors and deacons, which the word deacon, diakonos, is the same word for minister. So if you think that 1 Timothy 3:2 and 3:12 are restricting the ministry to just men, then you need to be consistent and true to Paul's statement and say that the ministry is restricted only to married men. And then we could take that argument even further and say that not only must pastors and ministers be married men, but married men with at least 2 offspring, because both 1 Timothy 3:4 and 3:12 say that bishops and deacons should have their children, plural, in submission. You see, this argument is a clear example of taking an idiom or phrase too literally and not in its context. When someone says it's raining cats and dogs, they don't literally mean cats and dogs are falling from the sky. Husband of one wife, or one wife man, as it says in the Greek, is simply a way of saying monogamous or faithful in your marriage. It doesn't require a pastor or minister to be married, but if they are married, they have to be faithful in their marriage. And the fact that Paul uses masculine terms here doesn't restrict bishops and deacons or pastors and ministers to men only, especially considering the fact that Paul specifically called Phoebe, a woman, a deacon or minister in Romans 16:1. I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, who is a diakonon tes ecclesias, a minister of the church. Same word for deacon in 1 Timothy 3:8. The fact is that Paul used masculine terms. That's called grammatical gender. It has nothing to do with the actual sex of the person. The word for bishop and the word for deacon is masculine, so you have masculine articles and pronouns that modify those masculine nouns. It's like in Proverbs 9, where wisdom is called a she or her. Wisdom built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. Well, this isn't saying wisdom is a woman. The feminine pronouns are simply because the word wisdom in both Hebrew and Greek is feminine. But let's say for argument's sake that Paul is specifically talking about men as bishops and deacons in 1 Timothy 3:1-8. This still would not exclude women in ministry roles because 1 Timothy 3:11 says, likewise also women must be. Now the King James Version and other English translations render this as their wives, but there is no personal pronoun or definite article here in Greek, as if to indicate that the women in verse 11 somehow belong to the deacons. It's just the Greek word gynaikos, women. And in this way, Paul has included women within the qualifications of bishops and deacons, or as we would call them today, pastors and ministers. So a common question is, how can a woman serve as a pastor without usurping authority over her husband? This question actually illustrates a huge misunderstanding of what role a pastor plays in a Christian's life. As mentioned earlier, 1 Timothy 2:12 prohibits a woman from domineering over her husband. And if you think this prohibits her from being a pastor, then you're saying that pastors domineer over their congregations. Now, I've known some pastors who domineer over their congregations, and they won't suffer a woman to teach, but they'll get behind the pulpit and cause everyone to suffer. You see, this misconception of God can call a woman to preach but not to pastor is based upon a flawed comparison of the fivefold ministry to the American business model. The fivefold ministry is not a hierarchy where the pastor serves as the CEO of the corporation with the highest voting authority and everyone just toes the line of what the pastor says or else. No, pastors are also to be accountable to the congregation. Ephesians 5:21, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. The pastor is not the head of the church. Jesus is the only head of the church. Ephesians 5:23, and the rest of us who are not Jesus, which includes the pastor, are members of the body, submitting ourselves one to another. The Bible gives us several examples of women in leadership roles, but I think the best example occurs in Judges 4:4, where it says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time, and the children of Israel came to her for judgment. As a judge, Deborah was in a position of spiritual authority over Israel, which would include her own husband. But as a wife, she was also in a place of spiritual submission to her own husband. Judging Israel did not mean that Deborah was domineering over her husband, but the fact that Lapidoth was her husband did not grant him some sort of immunity from her spiritual authority as a judge. Now, with all that being said, are there any practical or cultural reasons why a woman should not serve as a pastor in a particular setting or geographical region? Yes. There are situational dynamics in which it just would not be best for a woman to serve as a pastor. It has nothing to do with whether they are biblically authorized or a woman's ability to lead a church. It has everything to do with how certain communities respond to female pastoral leadership, or how serving as a pastor aligns with other practical aspects of the woman's life. And understand, I'm not talking about where a wife co-pastors with her husband. That's a different dynamic. I'm talking about where a woman by herself serves as the pastor. There are cultural and practical situations where a woman pastor would not readily be received. From a practical point of view, one thing in particular that may cause difficulties for a woman serving as the pastor of the church is pregnancy. Pregnancy itself introduces physical and logistical realities that can complicate pastoral work for a woman. Likewise, pregnancy and subsequent family responsibilities creates practical pressure that male pastors rarely face. There's fatigue, morning sickness, standing on your feet, and then there's the postpartum recovery, feeding the baby, unpredictable sleep, which all of these things conflict with long Sunday services, evening visitations, counseling sessions, or crisis calls in the middle of the night. None of these challenges mean a woman cannot pastor a church. They simply highlight the practical realities and the unique set of pressures that male pastors typically do not face. Culturally speaking, there are various locations in the United States and other countries that simply would not accept a woman as the pastor of the church. Well, we need to break those cultural norms. Well, good luck with that. You'll spend more time trying to break cultural norms than you will spreading the gospel. And what would be the purpose of the end game? Politics? Cultural diversity? Be like Paul and Barnabas. Just shake the dust off your feet and move to a location where people would more easily and readily accept a woman in church leadership. Think about the difference between the first century patriarchal Jewish culture in Jerusalem, and that's patriarchal in religion and business, versus the more matronal Greco-Roman culture elsewhere, where you have a greater public visibility of women who own businesses, and women who served as the matriarch or patroness of a home. And then think about how well a female pastor would have been accepted in those different locations. In Jerusalem, a very low chance, but you'd have a moderate to higher chance in places like Rome and Corinth. When we think of cultural acceptance of women pastors, we can also add to that gender acceptance. And by that, I mean that there are women themselves who resist female pastoral leadership. Now, quite honestly, this has more to do with social comparison and family structure than anything. When I was at UGST, we discussed women in ministry in one of our classes, and of all the ladies in that course, only one of them accepted or recognized women as pastors. And it just so happened that this young lady at that time was a single woman, and her mother served as the co-pastor of the church. The other 2 or 3 single ladies and all the married women in this class said they did not agree with women serving as pastors. Now, interestingly, the married women all gave the same reason why they would not attend a church with a woman pastor, and that is because they don't want their husbands taking directions from another woman. As one of the sisters in the class put it, quote, "I don't want another woman telling my husband what to do," end quote. Now, right, wrong, or indifferent, she certainly sees a woman in a pastoral role as challenging the family's traditional structure. Women may be bigger opponents to female pastors because they evaluate her through a relational lens, not just a leadership lens. In conclusion, does the Bible authorize women to serve as pastors? Yes. God's calling into the fivefold ministry does not limit women to 1 or 2 ministerial roles. Is it always practical for a woman to serve as a pastor? The honest answer is no. A woman who feels the call to pastor will have to navigate cultural and practical challenges wisely by being intentional for the greater good of the spread of the gospel. This may include moving to a location where a female pastor would be accepted, or co-pastoring a congregation with your husband, even if the husband takes the more second chair role. Beyond that, a woman pastor also needs to develop a trusted leadership team who can preach, visit, and lead during practical situations where she cannot, and thus ensure the church's stability and her own well-being. I'm Dr. Weatherly, and this is the Apostolic Inc. podcast.